Most of you are no doubt familiar with Little House on the Prairie. You probably know the books written by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and some of you may be better familiar with the TV series that ran for so long in the 1970s. I grew up watching Little House on the Prairie. I remember watching that every week as a child. And this past week, Blake and I checked out a DVD of Little House on the Prairie from the library, and we're watching a few episodes of that. You certainly remember Pa Charles Ingalls, played by Michael Landon. Probably some of you had a crush on Michael Landon, you know, with his curly black hair and his manly good looks, his can-do attitude. And of course there was Ma Ingalls, Carolyn, with her blonde hair pulled back tight, and little Carrie always doing something cute. Laura, freckly-faced and buck-toothed, always getting into trouble. And then Mary, who's prim and proper and always does exactly what she should. Well, in the particular episode that we watched this past week, there was a disciplinary problem in the little one-room schoolhouse. The teacher couldn't maintain order. There were a bunch of older boys in the class, and they were up to no good. They would get into mischief. They wouldn't mind what Miss Beadle would tell them to do. And so there was basically a riot in the schoolroom. And the parents got wind of this in the school board, and there was no way they were going to allow that to take place. So they canned the beloved Miss Beadle and brought in a replacement, a stern Mr. Applewood, or Crab Applewood, as the students called him, because he was serious. He was there to put an end to the bad behavior and the disciplinary problems in the school. But what ended up happening actually is that little Laura, ended up becoming the victim of all kinds of unfairness, all kinds of injustice and oppression by Mr. Crab Applewood. It started early on when she was receiving a note that someone had passed. Someone at the back of the schoolroom wrote a note, and there's this whole chain of people passing the notes up, and so it ends up in Laura's hands, and Mr. Applewood, of course, turns around and sees that and tells her to come up, and what is this? And it's a note saying, Mr. Crab Applewood, and Laura gets in big trouble for writing and passing notes, and she starts to protest and says, wait a minute, I didn't do this. And he says, well, I suppose this note just wrote itself and passed itself, did it? And she says, no. And you're saying, Laura, come on, speak up for yourself. You know, she didn't write the note. She didn't pass the note. And yet she ends up getting detention and having to write on the blackboard all day, and it's awful. The next day, some students are protesting the teacher dropping their books on the wood floors to make a loud noise and disrupt the class. And Laura's not involved, but she gets the blame once again. The pranks get worse. Someone during recess sneaks into the classroom and takes a bottle of blue ink and pours it in Mr. Applewood's satchel. He's got one of these upholstered satchels that he carries his books and papers in, just pours it in there. And Laura has come in after this has happened in order to do some remedial spelling work. And she doesn't know what's happened. And Mr. Applewood comes in and sticks his hand in the bag and pulls it out full of blue dripping ink. And Laura gets the blame. She was the only one in the room. It's so unfair. And when you watch this, you're crying out because it's totally unjust. And Mr. Applewood has got it in his mind that Laura is up to no good. And so everything that goes wrong, he blames her. She's just oppressed by him repeatedly. And so the audience empathizes with poor little Laura. Well, life, in many cases, is not fair. Life is not fair. There is injustice and oppression in the world. Here and now, under the sun, as the passage we're looking at in Ecclesiastes tells us, there is often no comfort to be found for the oppressed. There is no justice in many cases. There is no justice, and there will be no justice under the sun for many people who are experiencing injustice. And so why is that the case? And what should we expect about that? Well, injustice and oppression will be dealt with once and for all. But that's going to happen when the Lord returns. That's going to happen in the new heavens and the new earth. Then there will be an end to oppression and injustice when Christ reigns in righteousness and glory. But in the meantime, we're going to look at this passage here beginning in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 16 through 4:3, where the preacher says, moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. And in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. Injustice, unrighteousness. And then beginning in chapter 4 of Ecclesiastes, again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. what's happening in this text is that the preacher is looking at the world in our state of mortality, under the sun, under the curse, the punishment of God for sin, and he sees we're in a pickle, we're in a real mess. The places where you expect there to be justice, where there ought to be justice, there is no justice. In the place where you would expect to find champions for the poor, for those who are oppressed, for those who are defenseless, someone to rise up and speak out for them or take action to defend them, no one does. There's no comfort for the oppressed. And so the preacher is very discouraged about this. You see, in Laura Ingalls' case, you would expect the teacher to be fair. You would expect the teacher to hear her argument, to hear what she was doing, to investigate even a little bit. And you're so angry watching this man who's supposed to be responsible and has some authority, and he abuses it and ends up just unjustly oppressing Laura. Even in the place of justice with the teacher whom you're supposed to trust, there is wickedness and unrighteousness and oppression with no one to comfort. This is so helpful to us because much of Ecclesiastes is about the fleeting pleasures of the world. That's about how life is a vapor, and how even if you get your hand on something that makes you happy for 5 minutes, it's only going to last for 5 minutes, and then the pleasure is gone. So much of Ecclesiastes is about the good things of life and how they don't really last. It's good for us to remember that even when we're experiencing pleasure or the good things of life, there are others, always. There are always others who have none of that. They don't even get their 5 minutes of comfort and pleasure. We'll talk more about that later on in the sermon. But it's good for us to remember that the preacher is looking at the vanity of life, and he's not just saying that the good things of life are vain. There are some situations, some people who never have anything good, and there's no hope for them. This is a hopeless passage. There's no one to wipe their tears away. There is no justice. You can't appeal to a higher court. There's no hope here under the sun. So this is a depressing passage in a certain way, but we'll see that this depressing aspect doesn't have the last word. But I want to call your attention to the fact that there is so much injustice and oppression in society. I think it's very easy for us to come to church and we sit here and it's comfortable. Most of us are very comfortable in life. Certainly we have some concerns about things. You know, our finances might be in disorder. We might be separated at a great distance from people we love. We might have trouble finding work. There could be all kinds of problems in our life, okay? But it's, I think, hard for us to empathize with those who are suffering from injustice, those who are being oppressed. So I want to give you a catalog of some examples of this to get your mind around all the problems that are in the world that we're insulated from, many of us. All injustice and all oppression is a misuse, an abuse of power and authority. It happens on playgrounds and in school buses. People bully other people. I read something online this week about a child who basically grew up, it's a white guy who grew up somewhere in Idaho, and he describes the town in which he grew up as basically like a neo-Nazi outpost. So everybody there is basically a neo-Nazi. And so they would bully blacks, they would bully Hispanics, and it was just, he was white, he wasn't involved in any of this. He was also kind of a nerd, so he would be bullied. But that he describes an incident in a school bus in which basically a guy from Mexico gets on the bus, and as he's making his way from the front of the bus to the back of the bus, the guy is just abused the whole way. Well, it's not unlike that Florida State band member who was hazed and killed a month or two ago, right? That's what happened to this kid that's being described. He's just bullied and abused by these other kids, and the driver can't do anything about it. The driver's got to keep his eye on the road, right? These kids reign supreme, oppressing each other and committing injustice. There's injustice and oppression in many of our labor practices. Labor practices are exploitative. In many countries of the world, there are sweatshops where people work long hours for very little pay, and there's no regard to their safety or their comfort, the needs of their family. If you can't come in because you have to take care of your sick infant, you lose your job. That's the way it was even in the West in the last century, 2 centuries ago. Even today, maybe you work casual labor. Maybe your employer is required to pay you overtime, but he doesn't do it. Even though it's the law to pay you overtime, he doesn't do it, and you're afraid to say anything about it. It's exploitation. It's oppression. It's injustice. There's human trafficking. This is kind of a new word, trafficking in humans. We used to call it slavery. All right, but basically that's what it is. Especially happens with women who are forced into prostitution, children who are forced into prostitution. They are lured away from their families. In some cases, they are sold by their families because their families need money, but essentially they're promised education or a better life or something like that. They are transported to a new place where their passports are taken away and they're forced to live in squalid conditions and basically buy back their freedom and the cost of their transportation through prostitution or something. This happens. Believe me, it happens in New York City. 25 miles from here, there are people who are being held against their will and forced into prostitution. So there's all kinds of oppression and injustice. Gangs, organized crime, protection money rackets. You got to pay protection money to the gang or to the mob, which basically means if you pay them, they won't trash your shop or torch your home. You're paying money to protect yourself against them. It's extortion. It's give me your money or your life. It happens with gangs in cities. If you're a kid growing up, you gotta join the gang that's in your neighborhood. They won't let you be otherwise. You gotta have protection. Right? You want to have protection, you gotta join the gang. And part of joining the gang is you gotta do all kinds of hideous, unjust, and oppressive things. You're oppressed and forced into oppressing other people. This happens. It happens in more ordinary, mundane ways too. Some of you may have experiences with abusive spouses or abusive parents. Parents can be unjust. Spouses can be unjust and oppress you. Or bureaucrats. I've seen situations at the Department of Motor Vehicles where a person has been waiting in line, they filled out the form wrong. It's very easy for the person to explain just how to fill out the form, or just let the person just make the change right then and there. You know, it takes 4 seconds, and yet they force the person out of line and they got to go through the whole process again. They're just abusing their power over people. And it happens in the church too. Some of you probably know people who won't step foot in a church because they know the story of abuses of power within the church. You've heard of congregations that try to force their pastor out. You've heard of pastors who try to force families out of the church that they don't like. Churches have often been places where gossip and slander and unkindness proliferates and spreads like gangrene. And in the history of the church, there's been a lot of oppression and injustice. Of course, the Crusades is a classic example, where forget about the rightness or wrongness of the Crusades as a whole. Just you get these soldiers out there with Christian flags supposedly in the name of Christ, and what are they doing? They're looting and pillaging and raping and, you know, just being lawless in the name of Christ. It's unjust. In the age of exploration, you had supposedly Christian missionaries forcing people to convert at the threat of their lives. Convert or die. And now that you've converted, now you have to work in our camp and do exactly what we tell you, and basically you've become our slaves. It's oppression and injustice. The Salem witch trials, where the church is looking for guilt, overzealously concerned about witchcraft, and so they're looking for things and making mountains out of molehills. Christians during the 19th century mistreated their slaves. They tried to justify slavery on biblical grounds, and they may have mistreated their slaves as well. I have no doubt about that. If you read Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's full of accounts. It's fictional, but it's, you know, sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, right? I'm sure the reality was much worse. Accounts of Christian slave owners who are cruel and inhuman to their slaves. And then, of course, there's the clergy sex abuse scandal in the Roman Catholic Church. So the church is not exempt from injustice and oppression. Now, why do people oppress other people? Why is there this injustice that the preacher in Ecclesiastes is so concerned about, that he's so discouraged about? Why does this happen? Well, it may be from simple lack of love, a simple indifference. The person who is your landlord, who's supposed to fix your hot water heater, may just not care about you. May just not even care. Totally indifferent. May not be anything more complicated than that. That's a hassle, and I don't care if you have a hot shower or not. I got other things I want to do. I want to watch the Super Bowl. I'm not going to go fix your hot water heater. But the Lord has something to say to people like that. If you look in Matthew chapter 24, beginning in verse 41, I'll read it to you. Matthew 21, well, I'll read a little bit earlier than that.